First of all, I would like to thank you so much for accepting this meeting, and I'm so grateful and I'm so honored to have this meeting with you. I was so inspired by your books. I have this with me, Made in America, and this is Anatomy of an Epidemic in Korean version. So, could you start by giving us a brief introduction about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So, I have a long background writing about medicine and science in a journalistic context for newspapers, a little bit for magazines, and then books. And also, I did have a time as director of publications at Harvard Medical School. And that was in the 1990s when there was a lot of talk about evidence-based medicine. Really, we need to practice according to evidence-based medicine. And one of the ideas with evidence-based medicine is that doctors can be deluded about their merits of their therapies. And so that really trained me to go in to look at the evidence. What does the evidence really say? And I got interested in psychiatry, not because I was interested in psychiatry. What happened was, after I left regular daily journalism, I co-founded a company called CenterWatch, which looked at the business of the clinical development of new drugs and clinical trials. And while doing that, I became aware that trials were being designed to make their new drugs look good compared to old drugs, and results were being spun. And so if you looked at, I used freedom of information requests. If you looked at the data that was sent to the FDA and you looked at their reviews of it, that told a very different story about new drugs so often than what was told to the public. And the classic example of this was, in fact, the antipsychotics. So this was the first time I really saw that the story that was being told to the public, and in many ways did exist in certain ways in the research literature, was out of odds with actually the underlying data. So that was my first thing. And again, psychiatry seemed to be the case study of the spinning of results and that sort of thing. I wrote a series for this on the Boston Globe, and then I wrote Mad in America because, very simply, we were being told that these drugs fix chemical imbalances in the brain, which is a story of great medical progress. We were learning the biology of schizophrenia and so forth. And we had drugs that fixed this abnormality like insulin for diabetes. But then I went into outcome studies, and it showed that outcomes for schizophrenia patients were declining in modern times. They were now no better than they had been in the first third of the 20th century. That belies this narrative of progress. And then there were these cross-cultural studies which compared outcomes in the US and 5 other developed countries with outcomes in, quote, developing countries. And the outcomes in the developing countries were much better. And what was so interesting is then they did 2 such studies, the World Health Organization, and the second one, they measured antipsychotic use. And they found that in the countries that did best, they used the drugs acutely, but not chronically. So this made me why I wrote Mad in America. Why are outcomes so poor here? And really looking at the stories we tell about psychiatric treatments over time and then with drugs. So in short, because of various reasons, I became a journalist that thought you can't just take what the experts are telling you. You need to go into the scientific literature and find out what is the scientific story really saying. Is it in sync with the public narrative or not? And what you find in psychiatry, it's completely out of sync with the public narrative. And one of the best examples actually is the chemical imbalance story. That was being told around the world, and that you go into the research and you find that they didn't find it to be so. And this goes back to the 1980s. So, for example, the low serotonin theory of depression, the American Psychiatric Association's own textbook in 1998 declared it dead. So the story is, as a journalist and writing about this, I had a training that really sent me to, okay, you have to look at the documents. And there's both documents in the published literature, but also sometimes you can get documents through freedom of information requests and that sort of thing, and documents discovered in lawsuits. And very simply, as a journalist, I was trying to show that this public narrative is out of sync with the scientific narrative. And that fact that it is so is causing harm because we organize our thinking and care around the false narrative rather than the real narrative of science. So that's sort of my introduction.
Thank you for sharing your introduction. And I've also gone through the similar speech you made, like I'm in Quebec, and I've gone through your video clips. So would you give me a time to introduce myself to you?
Sure, please.
Okay, so my name is Daehyun Ro, as you can see at the left bottom of my screen. And I am actually a doctor of Korean medicine, specializing in mental health. I've studied chemistry and anthropology in the US at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. before transitioning into medical school. So in my practice, I primarily treat patients suffering from the side effects and withdrawal symptoms from psychiatric medications. And through this work, I have come to realize just how many people are struggling due to these drugs. It's been like almost 10 years since I left the US, so I think the situation might be different. But when I first came to South Korea, the psychiatry field itself in South Korea was not as big as the US, but now it's growing really big. That psychiatric clinics have increased by 77%. I don't know if you are familiar with the South Korean culture, but it's really academically competitive here. So recently there has been a culture and like the social stigma rising up, making children to study English and take tests to like 3-year-old kids, which later making them to take ADHD stimulants even though they're not really ADHD patients. So the patients that I'm treating, almost every one of them have taken psychotropic medications for over a year, 5 years, or over 10 years, even as long as 20 years. And they're just say like the similar things that they only wanted to use it for acute timeline, but they ended up using it for over a decade. So now they're having a difficult time finding an alternative treatment since they're addicted to it. So that's basically my clinical experiences, I think, basically similar to your opinion. So that's why I wanted to have this conversation with you. So since you're a journalist, I wanted to ask if you have suffered any obstacles about writing and criticizing about psychiatry.
Yeah, of course. By the way, the story you describe in South Korea, and of course, I do know that it's a very intense culture with its kids and competitive, and it starts early on, and it causes a lot of stress for the youth in South Korea. I mean, the pressures are enormous. But it's really interesting. Basically, your story about now who you're dealing, what's happening to individuals, what you're seeing in your clinical practice. This is happening in country after country. Where we've exported our disease model of care. It happens in every country, and that's what has happened. We exported our disease model of care, that false story, and you see this happening over and over again. Now, have I had attacks? Absolutely. And it's interesting that there's a very big one that happened yesterday. You'll need to read this. So you read Anatomy of an Epidemic, and basically it shows how psychiatry told us a false narrative, and it looks at the financial reasons for that and guild interests and so. So when the book came out, the psychiatrists launched pretty amazing attacks on me, to be honest with you, to discredit me. And they planted a review in the Boston Globe that was really nasty. It likened me to a dictator in South Africa who, by virtue of denying AIDS, had caused hundreds of thousands of people to die. So then there were some book reviews that were published in psychiatric journals that accused me of bias, cherry picking. Now, they didn't give any examples. It was just an ad hominem attack. So there was that. And it was rough, to be honest. And by the way, that silenced all my fourth book. Newspapers didn't review it after that initial Boston Globe because it was seen as irresponsible. There was even like, when I would be given talks, lawyers would contact, these lawyers being paid, would contact the groups paying for me to give a talk, paying usually just paying my travel or maybe an honorarium of a couple $100. They would basically say, threaten the organization that this is misuse of funds because this guy's a crank. So yes, it's been hard. And then I'll talk about yesterday. The book very much stood the test of time. The studies I cited, you can't find any of the investigators saying I misinterpreted it or that's not what the study showed. Not one out of more than 1,000 studies in that book. They can't actually point to any study that I didn't include that should have been included. So it's really stood the test of time in that way. And it did win the Investigators, Reporters, and Editors Association Award in 2010 for the best investigative book. So have there been attacks on me? Yes. There's been attacks on me. That's the only way to say, by psychiatry and stuff. But what is the nice thing is it has A, stood the test of time. B, it hasn't been documented anything, any journalistic sin. 3, it did get this award. And 4, it has had an incredible impact. It really has. I can tell you that, for example, when I gave a talk in India, which was a meeting attended by representatives from the World Health Organization and by the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Health, I gave the keynote talk. It was called for a paradigm shift in care, and they went back. and they both issued calls for a paradigm shift in care. And behind the scenes, they were not only following up on a lot of our research, visiting initiatives that we had talked about, but I run a website, Matt in America. You send emails there. They actually hired our science writers to be consultants on those projects. I was asked to come to Norway multiple times. They eventually started a medication-free initiative. In other words, if people didn't want a medication in the hospitals, they could get it. Asked to come to Israel. I mean, I've gone all over the world practically. But for example, I went to Israel numerous times. The Ministry of Health paid for me to go there to give a talk, and that led for them to establish soteria houses, which are alternative forms of care. So it's been an up and down ride, and it has been tough. But what has been nice is it has had an impact. It stirred further research, by the way, into the long-term outcomes. All that further research has confirmed what the story was in Anatomy of an Epidemic, that these drugs are worsening the aggregate outcomes. But I'll give you an example of what I still face. So yesterday there was a huge article in the New York Times about drug withdrawal movement. And about a woman named Laura Delano who wrote for us beginning in 2010 about her own desire to get them off the drugs. And once she got off the drug, her life straightened out. And she's got a new book coming out called Unshrunk. And she also runs sort of like what you do. She runs an online group for people. She's a peer, but it's an online group where people can discuss strategies for coming off the drugs. So in her book, she cites Anatomy of an Epidemic as the book that changed her life. Oh, I read this and I saw myself through a different lens. I met with Bob and I got off the drugs, and now look at me, I'm having a great life. So in the middle of this article, and you can go on, can you get on the New York Times? If not, I'll send you a copy of the article. All of a sudden, the reporter goes, in science journals, reviews have shown that, or reviews have dismissed his analysis because it's a polemic based on cherry picking of data and overly simplistic and broad. So I said, what science journals? Where did you find this? And she pointed to me to 3 book reviews by psychiatrists that didn't list anything, but just hurled those things at me. So that shows the sort of way that newspapers trying to defend the common wisdom will just go out and attack you. So that's a long-winded answer, but yes, it can be hazardous to break with a conventional narrative. You're breaking with a conventional narrative, and I don't know how publicly you're doing it. But I will say that practitioners who break with the conventional narrative, you have a private practice?
Yes.
Okay, you're doing okay. But if you work in a system, you can get out of that system as a professional.
That's true.
So it's tough. And think of this narrative. Psychiatry as a guild has placed its prestige in that narrative. This is why you should look at legitimacy as medical doctors. Pharmaceutical companies, of course, it's a huge market. So you have vested capitalistic and guild interests. And if you challenge those two things, capitalist societies, you're going to get hammered.
That's exactly the point that I was going to make. Because like I told you, I'm a doctor of Korean medicine, which is not really an MD. So here in South Korea, especially, MDs have strong political power and authority. So like everything that goes against their opinions is usually attacked and disregarded, I think. So that's why I asked you. So I just wanted to know, despite facing criticism and such resistance, you have dedicated so much of your work to exposing the issues surrounding psychiatric medications. What has driven you to stay committed to this despite the challenges? And what kind of world or future do you envision as a result of your efforts?
Well, the reason that I have stayed with this story is because this story has changed our society. It's changed South Korea. It's changed how you raise your kids, and we're pathologizing kids. So it's having a huge impact on us, how we think about ourselves, how our society organizes itself, and how we raise our children. I don't know anything that is on a global scale has so profoundly changed society. It's unbelievable. And it is clearly doing harm. You're seeing it in your practice. It's doing harm to kids. Say, for example, ADHD. There's no evidence anywhere that it benefits kids over the long term. None. And they even admit it. But there's all sorts of things about becoming addictive. Sometimes it can even stir psychotic episodes. It can make people more socially isolated. There's all sorts of negatives with taking stimulants every day. Anyway, you ask why, what keeps me doing it? I have received so many emails from people said, thank you. You saved my life. I got off the drugs and I have a new life. So thank you. I was just at the book launch for Laura Delano's book last night. A woman comes up and goes, I wrote you 3 years ago, and my daughter was on like 20 drugs and she was 18. She's now off all drugs. She's in college. She's doing great. You saved my daughter's life. And her daughter was there and just said, I want to thank you. You kept me from being a lifelong mental patient. So that's why. It's extreme societal importance. And the narrative, frankly, is changing in many ways, thanks to Anatomy of an Epidemic and Mad in America. Because people don't feel so isolated. Just like you found Mad in America and you wrote us, that sort of thing. There's a whole community out there, a growing community that is saying, this just is not helpful and it's not scientific. And Mad in America, we have affiliates now in like 17 countries. The affiliate in South Asia, Mad in India, they may even be setting up a page in Korean. I'll have to go ask them, but I think that they're setting up pages in Chinese. I think they may have a page in Korean. I'll have to go on and see.
I'll have to look for it too. So talking about science, I know you have mentioned about the pathology of psychiatry, about how conventionally falsely it is, like the chemical imbalance of brain and everything. I know you have mentioned that it's just an hypothesis and the doctors are still trying to investigate the chemical imbalance. Do you still believe that it is a false information?
It has been investigated in the United States. It was investigated starting in the late 1970s. And to be honest with you, investigations mostly ceased around 2000. And the reason they ceased is all the ways they tried to investigate it didn't show, for example, people with depression had abnormally low serotonin. It just didn't show that. Even the same with schizophrenia. It's a bit more complicated with schizophrenia, but they actually didn't find there was a lesion in the dopaminergic system. Okay.
Yes.
And you can find that in medical journals, psychiatric journals. We didn't find it. We hypothesized, we didn't find it. It really isn't being investigated anymore. They've moved on because it didn't show this characteristic pathology. Now, what they also found is that the drugs induce the very changes, the very abnormalities hypothesized to cause the problems in the first place. That's what they actually found and why they don't really want to talk about it anymore, because what they found is so upsetting. We didn't find that people had abnormalities in chemistry. Our drugs create those abnormalities in chemistry, and people have said, this is the reason we're getting such bad long-term outcomes. This can be a biological mechanism for explaining why things run more chronic, why we have all these adverse effects. Is it still being taught in South Korea? Are patients still being told about chemical imbalances in South Korea?
Yes, absolutely. I can't agree with you more about that. I mean, the patients are taught about that and they just simply don't think about like the actual medical journals, and they just kind of accept 100% what the doctors say.
Do you know how this was exported to South Korea and countries around the world? Well, going back to the 1990s, when this whole story about these great new drugs, and this is when the pharmaceutical companies and the American Psychiatric Association were promoting this chemical imbalance story on their websites. Well, if you would have gone to the annual meeting of the American Psychiatric Association, over half the people there were from outside the United States, Korea, South America. They weren't paying to come. They were being paid to come. And they were wined and dined, and there would be free events. And they would go to these talks where they get a free breakfast, lunch, dinner, and it would be a talk by a famous American psychiatrist. Well, that psychiatrist was being paid by the pharmaceutical companies to give that talk. And I don't really know about the laws, but one of the ways that they exported this model of care is doctors, like say from a country, South Korea, would go back home, and then they would be getting paid by pharmaceutical companies to be the thought leaders in that country. So this is a model for exporting a product. And so the doctors basically go back to their home countries. They become the salesman. And so they say this stuff. And they're sort of led to believe this because so often the psychiatrists themselves, they haven't gone to the research literature. They haven't researched this. Do you think that many South Korean psychiatrists have really gone through the history of research into the chemical imbalance theory? Have they read the scientific articles? No way. No, they haven't. That's the point. They're just parroting like a marketing propaganda.
I recently talked with one psychiatrist, and he actually thought the hypothesis that you're talking about is like the scientific law. He was actually believing it, and I showed him proof, cited your book, and he was kind of surprised that everything that he was learning in medical school was kind of false.
For psychiatrists that have their eyes open, it's a feeling of real betrayal. Then why was I taught this?
Yeah. And it's very hard for them to open their eye. And it's even harder for patients.
People have organized their thinking and their lives around that story. And once you accept I have a brain chemistry problem, cognitive dissonance sets in.
So continuing with that, expanding from that, in South Korea, when people have mild feelings of sadness or difficulty concentrating, it's like a common quote that everyone would say, go see a doctor and talk to a professional. I told you it's been nearly 10 years since I left the US, and I'm just being curious, is that the same social and cultural situation in the US too?
Unbelievable. If you would have gone back in 40 years ago, no one went to, when they had a minor setback, went to a doctor. I mean, that, I shouldn't say no one, but it was pretty much understand culture. These things happened. They would pass. You had to learn to deal with them, that sort of thing. But then what happened, there were campaigns to say, no, these are real diseases. You got to go see a doctor. Well, now, believe it or not, we have something like 50% of our kids in college who see mental health counseling. If you look at our kids arriving at colleges, more than 25% have a diagnosis and a prescription. What is the percentage of Americans who take a psychiatric drug now? It's like 25% on a daily basis. So yeah, it's exactly what is happening in our country, that you go see a doctor if you're unhappy in your life, rather than say, well, why am I unhappy? Why am I stressed out? Why are our kids stressed out? Among a certain social strata, people are better off. They see their kids in this Darwinian competition to get into the best schools from the time they're like 4 years old. And they will go and say, oh, my kids, if their kid's not doing well enough in school, meaning like extremely well, they'll ask for ADHD medication. Now, in some countries, if you get a diagnosis, not only do you get the drugs, you get more time on tests. So it can be a break that way. Oh, this person has a disability. And next thing you know, you're getting longer time on tests than the other people who don't get that. So yeah, this is happening all over the place. And it's an amazing cultural shift. By the way, there's a new report coming out. It's about mental health surveys around countries around the globe. And it found that in countries that increase access to mental health services and promote it, they have worse mental health than countries that don't promote access and limit access to mental health services.
Actually, what's starting in South Korea, yeah. I remember back in when I was a college student, I remember students were easily getting Adderalls, even illegally. I remember that. So is that still the case in the US?
Oh yeah, the campuses are awash in drugs. Awash in drugs. You can now do a telehealth thing and get a stimulant sent to you now. So it's so easy to get it. And you know what happened, at least in a number of colleges, they get the prescriptions because they can sell the drugs too to other college students. So yeah, the schools are awash in drugs. It hasn't changed at all. It's gotten worse. I mean, I hate to say, especially for my son, by the time he got to college, he said, yeah, Dad, we were doing drugs like crazy, stimulants, everything.
And even illegal drugs too, right?
Oh, and of course, illegal drugs too. You know, LSD, marijuana, it's a complete drug culture.
So I think South Korea is showing like a start of that culture, because the psychiatric clinics in South Korea has increased by 77% compared to 5 years ago. And the market for psychiatric medication has grown by approximately 20%, from $220 million to $273 million.
Yeah, listen, if you look at this, the U.S. first does it in the U.S. and then it begins promoting to other markets around the world. And what happens is you're like 20 years behind us because it got promoted to you like 20 years and really took hold 20 years later. But now you are experiencing the same thing that really started taking hold in the United States in the 1990s.
So it's just getting started. What I witnessed when I was in college back in the U.S. So that's why I got into this psychiatric field, to save those in danger.
Well, listen, I think what you're doing is really important. You're providing a relief valve for a lot of people who are wanting to escape that world.
So that's why through this meeting with you, I hope to strongly raise awareness among Koreans about the risks and side effects of psychiatric medications, because many people are ignorant about it. So your insights and research have been valuable, and I believe they can have a significant impact in South Korea, where these discussions are still largely absent. People don't want to talk about it, or MDs, like the doctors, block people from talking about the side effects or withdrawal symptoms of psychotropic medications.
Yeah, they don't want to say that our drugs are doing harm, so they knock down the discussion. Listen, I'm glad it's translated into Korean. You can try to make help people read that book. I mean, the book does lay it out.
I've been recommending this to all my colleagues.
Oh, good.
I've also looked up the madinamerica.com and how you're doing work with your staff and everything. What were your goals at first when you established the organization, and how do you think your goals are going through?
So basically, I set up Mad in America
Mhm,
as a webzine to serve as a medium
mhm,
for making known science findings that the regular media just wasn't reporting because it wasn't being promoted to them by the pharmaceutical companies or by psychiatry as a guild. One was to make this science known, and that's why we have a science team and we have science reports like 4 days a week. That's number one. Number two, I wanted the voice of, like, what your patients, the voice of those who see themselves as harmed by this, or have had these experiences, difficulty coming off, to give them a public airing. They need to be part of the public discussion, and they weren't being heard in the general media. So in essence, it was to continue the work that was done in Anatomy of an Epidemic and keep it constantly updated and make this a place for people to learn about what is the science actually showing, what are some of the stories of people, and finally to do some, once we got some money, to do our own investigative journalism, that sort of thing. So you see, we do MI reports. We also interview people for our radio podcasts. So really, it's like an alternative media to tell the story of science. We started as an all-volunteer group. I finally got some funding for it. Honestly, Mad in America is having a huge impact. For example, Sir Robin Murray is this big psychiatrist in the UK. He was giving a talk, an international talk on critics of psychiatry, and he pointed to Mad in America as the premier critic of psychiatry in the world. First of all, our numbers of visitors keeps going up. We get around 600,000 visitors a month. And we do have these affiliate sites in 17 different countries, which shows that there is this resistance. Mad in America has been a seed for these grassroots resistance efforts in country after country. And actually, we're getting many, many more inquiries about starting affiliates. We just don't have the resources to do it. I've had to say no because we provide the infrastructure. We don't pay anybody, but we provide the infrastructure. It's really putting a stress on us because we just don't have much money. But yeah, I mean, I think Mad in America has become a home for a community that wants to know the science and is critiquing psychiatry and is looking to develop alternatives. And I think it's serving a good purpose in that way.
Thank you for sharing. I think I would love to have the whole staff in South Korea one day.
First of all, you could write a piece for us. We always invite bloggers from other countries to sort of do a report. What's it like in my country?
Okay.
So you could write a piece for Mad in America on that.
I would love to. Yeah.
Yeah, please do. Like, what is the situation in South Korea? That would be great. And, we can feature that. We also will probably promote it to our affiliates because they're always interested in these
I
international
would love to.
perspectives.
Thank you for sharing all this great information.
I'm really glad you're doing this. It's great. It's really inspiring to hear when, an individual in another country is really trying to respond to this harm that's being done to our societies and to our kids.
Yeah,
Kids can't be kids anymore.
I mean, I'm seeing it every day.
Kids just being pushed into this new identity as a mental patient. Terrible.
So the next question I wanted to ask, since you're a journalist rather than a medical doctor, have you faced any disadvantages or challenges in making these claims? Or has your background ever made it more difficult for your work to be taken seriously within the medical community?
Yeah, there's two answers to that. Sure. One of the medical community will say he's not a doctor. Well, my response is, yeah, you're right. I'm not, but I can read your literature, read your scientific literature.
Right.
And this is what your research is showing. And I'll say, like, you failed to be an honest communicator of your own literature. That's why a journalist had to step in. So on the one hand, it is used to discount me. Oh, he's not a doctor. But that's also saying, like, he's not a member of our tribe. You know the word tribe, what I mean by this? The medical guild, in a way, is like a tribe. Yeah. We're the keepers of the information. We're the ones that in society are the keepers. Second of all, at the same time, being a journalist gives me a certain freedom. Now, the mainstream media is not happy with this because they're reporting what they're being told by the psychiatrists. But nevertheless, the story of Mad in America shows that they couldn't really expel me from the journalistic tribe totally. So it gives me a freedom too. But it gives me a freedom, and also I have the perfect answer. Yeah, I didn't do this research. I'm just quoting your research. I'm just putting together what's in your research literature. So the problem isn't me. The problem is you don't know your own literature.
I think you're doing such a brave movement.
Oh, thanks.
So, continuing with that, have you ever spoken with psychiatrists who acknowledge the limitations of modern psychiatry or who are actively exploring alternative approaches?
Oh, yeah. Listen, I actually heard from a lot of psychiatrists
Mm-hmm.
when the book came out. I was asked to give grand rounds at maybe 15 medical schools. Now, sometimes I was attacked in those grand rounds, but on the other hand, there were many psychiatrists who saw this as really necessary, wanted to learn. I actually was made an adjunct faculty member at the Temple Medical School Department of Psychiatry. I've heard from a lot of psychiatrists actually thanking me for it. Now, they're almost afraid to do so publicly because you can't be seen as in league with Whitaker. There's plenty of psychiatrists that are really happy, not happy, but grateful that they have this information.
So yeah, I have this similar meeting with Dr. Alan Francis. He's the author of Saving Normal. He provided strong critiques of modern psychiatry, and his proposed alternative open field, in my opinion, is kind of abstract. So what do you see as the most realistic path for mental health care reform?
So the most realistic path is, so societies organize themselves around simple narratives, okay? It's a narrative. And we've had this narrative of these are diseases of the brain and they're fixed, the drugs help fix that, whatever the pathology is. Well, paradigm shifts happen when narratives collapse and a new narrative can take hold. And we are now at a place where the disease model narrative in so many ways is collapsing. When that does happen, that opens the possibility for a shift in thinking. So the way to reform mental health care is if a new narrative can take hold in society. And what is that new narrative? The new narrative is first, it's humble. It's like, we really don't know what causes all, there's a lot of different pathways to psychiatric stress and all the manifestations of it, whether it be anxiety, lack of attention, psychosis, mania. There's a lot of different pathways to those behaviors and experiences. But we don't know the biology of those pathways. But here's what we do know. We do know that human beings are responsive to their environments. That's what we're built to be, is responsive to our environments. So in South Korea, you have so many of your kids stressed out, not in a healthy way. You have a problem with how you're organizing your society. What are the environments that these kids are being raised in? What are the pressures they're facing? And we saw the World Health Organization put out there's 2 papers calling for a paradigm shift. And that's what they're saying is like this disease model has failed. We need a new model. So much what we need in a new model is what sort of communities do we live in? And if someone has a problem, what are some of the community responses that can help people break through isolation, get past their sorrow, whatever it might be, their grief, help kids do better in school. And there are programs that have been researched, for example, of changing schools. So in the United States, there's this program called the Nurtured Heart Approach. It's by Howard Glasser, and it's been studied over and over again. And what he does is he goes into schools, often schools where the kids are performing poorly, and he changes the classroom's environment, tries to make it an environment where people are curious. Kids want to be there. And what they find out is if you change from like rote learning and sort of disciplinary status where kids are expected to sit in their class at their desk all day long, if you create a thing where kids feel rewarded for curiosity, rewarded for problem solving, that sort of thing, and also rewarded for working with others to solve problems, you know what? ADHD symptoms basically go away. Kids thrive in those sort of things. So in other words, there is research that shows different ways, okay? And there's research showing that like in the UK, for example, you can prescribe for depressed patients what's called a green prescription. You know what the green prescription is? You get a free membership to a health club, work out. And you'll be encouraged to join groups that like go out in the forest and maintain forest walks and that sort of thing. So what they're saying is, oh, you're isolated and depressed? Well, here, let's get exercise, diet, and let's get you with other people and doing something that you're proud about. So it's not going to change from psychiatry deciding that it's going to change its therapies. Can a different narrative take hold in society which has a different view of humanity than the one that has been pitched to us that we're like the victims of our molecules? And this is, we human beings have been exquisitely sculpted by evolution to be responsive to our environments. So if you can change environments, you can lead to a more mentally healthy society. And also when people do have these troubles, it can become a way out of these problems. By the way, there's a new mental health survey coming out. I think I told you this. And they look at countries where there is a lack of access, but they have tried to make their society a healthier place with pollution, diet. And they point to Tanzania, which is one of the wealthier countries in Africa. And they said that's what they've done. They didn't increase access to mental health care. What they've done is improve the quality of life in their society for their kids. There are people calling for a paradigm shift around a different conception. And that's what we need. It's not going to happen from psychiatry. And what happens is the critique of psychiatry that you see in Mad in America in my book is that shows like, well, this way hasn't worked. So what change do we need? And it opens up different possibilities in that way. And you do see some governments pursuing these different possibilities. So that's what I see. We need a new narrative that really begins with philosophy, what it means to be human. And here's what I know about what it means to be human. You're responsive to your environment.
You're basically saying everything that I wanted to address. So how do you view the benefits and strengths of psychiatric medication? Do you think there are none?
You know Joanna Moncrief by any chance? Her work? You might read her book. She's a British psychiatrist, and she has a view of drugs like this. She calls it a drug-centered model. They're not fixing any cure. But let's say you're extremely anxious and you need a little break from that anxiety. Okay, if you have a drug like a benzodiazepine to use for a day or so, but just for a day or so, because you need to be tranquilized. You need a little bit relief from this constant anxiety. That's good. And basically, if you have drugs that can cause sort of a different, that can numb you out for a while, maybe tranquilize you for a bit. Sometimes we need that. Use them for that way. So that's a model that is accurate, saying, okay, these drugs cause changes in the way we experience the world, and sometimes that may be beneficial over the short term. Now, with antipsychotics, for example, the research seems to show that there may be a small group of people that initially have a psychotic episode that are going to need those drugs for life. The thing you see is maybe 20%. Yeah, so they do have a place, but they don't have a place as curative. And there's a really well-known psychiatrist named Nassar Ghaemi. He's a biological guy. And he says these drugs really should be used in the lowest doses possible and the lowest and for the shortest possible time. Well, diabetes, of course, you use them permanently often. You know? He's saying use them for the shortest. They're not like diabetes. These drugs are not like insulin for diabetes. We should be using these drugs for the shortest possible time and in the lowest possible doses, and basically not long term. So that's a sensible thing. But there is danger in starting the drugs in the first place because they get difficult to come off. So you should actually forego initial use and see if there aren't other ways. And that's, by the way, the most successful program that exists in treating psychosis does. And that's the open dialogue program. And they avoid putting people on antipsychotics initially. So they're trying to get people well without that. And roughly 2/3 of their patients get better without ever going on the drugs. So I do think there's a place for drugs if we look at, well, what are the sort of emotional states they can trigger, and we look at them honestly. What do they do to the brain? They do or change the brain. Does long-term use often lead to difficulty coming off? Yes. Are long-term outcomes poor? Yes. But nevertheless, within that framework of science, can you find a time that they're useful? And I think you can.
Thank you for sharing it. Just for an information, the way I treat patients to get away from the drugs is to make them gain the psychological resilience. That's the way that I treat, so they can walk away from the drug more easily.
By the way, that's a fantastic way of doing it.
And I have suffered an obstacle from medical doctors.
You get criticized. You get criticized by medical doctors.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
I don't think not as much as you, but I'm still getting criticized.
You get it. Sure.
Yeah. So given everything we've discussed today, do you see a realistic path for psychiatry or move away from its current reliance or medication? Like, what would need to happen for meaningful change to take place?
Well, here's what's happening in the United States. Psychiatry is going to need to reinvent itself pretty soon. The reason is there is more dissatisfaction with the drugs. But even beyond that is prescribing powers are expanding. It's not just doctors who can prescribe. Nurses can prescribe. And psychologists in many places can prescribe. What has fueled psychiatry's desire to, at least in the United States, to promote psychiatric drugs is because they were the only ones who could prescribe it. So that's what gave their medical degree commercial value. We can prescribe these, and we can make the diagnosis that justifies it. But most drugs now are being prescribed by general practitioners, not psychiatrists. You can get them through telehealth. Nurse practitioners can prescribe them. Psychologists can prescribe them. So they're no longer a product just that elevates psychiatry. So you see, like psychiatrists now are trying to, get on board with psychedelics and ketamine and other sort of things. Psychiatry right now, in many ways, is fishing around for a new therapy that can be unique to psychiatry. And so far, they haven't found it. In the United States, they're really thrashing around. And by the way, if you go to medical schools today in the United States, I hate to say it, but so many American-born people are not going into psychiatry. So often it's immigrants that are going into this field. And I think it's because the immigrant who obviously are very smart and getting into medical schools and that sort of thing. Because here's the thing, within American medicine, the rest of American doctors sort of look down on psychiatrists.
Compared to surgeons.
Or really even almost any neurologists or doctors that treat, diabetes. But there's a stigma about becoming a psychiatrist that does exist. And, I've talked to residents many times. So often they're really great kids. They're idealistic. And I think for whatever reason, really still have this sort of social idealistic view of things. They can help different communities. And they really haven't internalized the stigma from the rest of the medical community. But it is really notable, for example, so many people are of Indian descent, for example.
That I noticed when I was in the US too.
A lot of people of Indian descent.
And so, like I said, I wanted to write a paper that you mentioned about the psychiatric field in Korea.
Fantastic.
And I want to introduce my alternative treatment manual someday if I have chance to fly to Boston to meet with you in person.
Definitely, we'll do it.
So, it's been grateful and honorable and pleasure meeting you today. Thank you for your time. I can't agree with you more for everything what you have mentioned today. I'll look forward to keep in touch with you.
Please do keep in touch. It's been a pleasure for me. I actually take a lot of inspiration when I meet people in other countries who are doing what you're doing. So thank you. It's been inspiring for me. And please do write a piece for Mad America. It'd be great. About your work. You can cover what's going on in South Korea, your work. And do mention that one of the things you do is you try to increase psychological resilience. That's a great piece.
Thank you. So I can just contact with you the email that I sent you.
Yeah. Just do it that way.
All right. Thank you. So have a great day.
The pleasure's been mine.
Goodbye
And
from
good luck.
South Korea.
Thanks.
All right.